The Declaration of Independence laid the cornerstone of human government upon the first precepts of Christianity. Who would you think said that? Sounds like something that Jerry Falwell might have said, or perhaps a contemporary Christian nationalist that you hear about in the news. No. Instead, that quote comes from a man who, while as a child was raised as a Christian, nonetheless as an adult converted to Unitarianism, rejecting the deity of Jesus Christ, the Trinity, the inerrancy of the Scripture, not a man we would ever call a Christian as we would understand it. In fact, these are the words of our second president, John Adams, who should know a thing or two about the foundations of our country. I say this not to advocate for Christian nationalism at all. I think there's some dangerous things being said in this regard, often coming from pseudo-historians who call themselves Christians, but who play fast and loose with the truth of history. Not going to get into who that is today. You can email me privately. But I do say it to suggest that human government, rightly understood, has its source in God and his character, and that's what John Adams, our second president, said. I want to talk today about the Bible on government. Not only to talk about the government's responsibilities to its citizens, but about the responsibilities of Christians to the government. Keep listening, because I'm Byron Harvey, and I'm just thinking. Well, welcome to I'm Just Thinking, where I invite you to ask Jesus into your head. We continue today in a series I've entitled Not in Polite Company, the intersection of faith and politics. Today we're in episode number 6. We talk about what the Bible has to say about government, about the Christian's response, as I said in the intro. So let's dig right in. Let's take a look at government from biblical perspective. Though the first established human government was not the people of God in Israel. Egypt is a prime example of this. Of course, there was a government led by the Pharaoh, and Joseph led his family, having been in a position of leadership in that government, led his family to their salvation as they fled a famine and came to seek food in Egypt. But of course, you know the story. That government began to persecute more and more the people of God. We could go a long ways into that, no point in it today. But the Bible, the entire Bible, teaches the sovereignty of God. He rules and he reigns. And we see that in the case of what went on with regard to the government of Egypt and the Pharaoh there. Israel, God's chosen people, was to be a theocracy, to submit to God and to allow him to lead. Of course, God did raise up human leaders, Joseph being one of them, Moses, Joshua. Then for a time, judges ruled over Israel. That was a very dark period in the history of Israel. When I do my walk through the Bible, OT Live, which I'll tell you more about in a little bit, we say that the key word of the book of Judges is the word cycles, because we see a cycle going on, a 5-part cycle happening over and over 7 times in the book of Judges, and it gets worse every time. The people of Israel sin. God puts them into submission, to servitude, to some foreign power. They cry out to God and make supplication to Him. God brings them salvation through a judge. And then there's a period of silence. And then the cycle begins over and over again. All right. Going too deeply into that right now for my purpose, but the point is that that book, by the way, that dark period is capped off by an explanatory phrase that makes up the very last verse of the book of Judges. Ultimately, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Well, ultimately, we know the Bible teaches that Israel rejected God's leadership and demanded a king. And their reason was, tragically, instead of being a special nation ruled and reigned over by God, we want to be like all the other nations. Give us a king. And so God ordained Saul. That didn't go real well. And then David, that went much better, though he was an imperfect man, and his son Solomon, and there were a lot of issues in Solomon's reign despite his wisdom. But after the reign of Solomon, of course, the nation was divided into two by a civil war. Ultimately, both Israel and Judah, those two nations that came out of the nation of Israel during that time of civil war, they were sent into exile, first to Assyria, then to Babylonia, finally to Persia. Even though some returned from exile, Israel was never again to be a nation until 1948. But that's another story for another time. God is the source of human government. That's clear from Romans chapter 13, that any and every nation that rises, any and every leader that rises in those nations to take control of those governments is there because a sovereign God has decreed it to be so. That's kings, rulers, presidents, and congressmen that you like and ones that you don't, ones you agree with and ones that you don't, ones that rule justly and fairly and ones that are pure evil, and everything in between, and all of those counts. Romans 13 is, of course, really the key passage in all of the Bible dealing with the subject of the government from a Christian viewpoint. And so when we consider what's the purpose of government, well, Romans 13 describes three ultimate purposes of government. Not going to get deep into those. You can read them for yourself in the first part of that chapter. But the first one is the protection of law-abiding citizens. I think that the very first responsibility of government, the very first, not the only, but the first responsibility of government is to provide for national defense. This is the protection of our nation from those rogue actors and from those evil people and nations that would come in and do harm to those who want to live here in freedom and peace and abide by the law. And a corollary to that is the establishment of law enforcement at a local level. You know, you're not going to hear defund the police from this guy. Yeah, there are ways in which some of the police, because they're humans, because they're sinners, law enforcement has done some terrible things in the pursuit of their jobs, and they're going to probably keep doing some of those things as long as there are people involved. There's no excuse for it. They should be disciplined and punished, and we should do whatever we can to ensure that those episodes are fewer and fewer, and hopefully hardly ever make the news anymore. But the first role of human government is to protect those who want to live in freedom and peace and abide by the law. The second role is the restraining of evildoers. It goes along with that one, including their punishment when they violate the law. And that is part of that whole idea of law enforcement at the local level, how important that is, and our system of courts and our system of laws, so that rules are made and enforced, and accountability takes place for those who break the law. The third is the promotion. We find this again as well in Romans 13, the promotion of human flourishing. And in 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul gives this as a reason to pray for those in authority, that we might live those peaceful lives and might flourish. So government, we can say, has an important but a limited role. Jesus says as much when he says, there are some things that rightly belong to the domain, the realm of Caesar, and there are things that belong in the realm of God. And our role as people who follow the Jesus who said those things is to rightly understand which of those things are which, and then to render to each that which God has established as befitting them. Some things we render to God, some things we render to the human authorities who are over us. And while Jesus' response was to a narrow question asked by the religion boys, hey, should Jews pay taxes to Caesar? That was a narrow question. His response was far, far broader. He wasn't just saying pay your taxes to the government and pay your tithe to God, but rather it was an acknowledgement that to each is due far more than simply our money, but some other things. We're going to talk about some of those as well. That leads us to consider our main topic for the day. What do we owe to our governmental leaders? And so let's do that in the context of considering some truths about the government and about those governmental leaders. First truth: human government is presented in the Bible as a general good. We need to keep this in mind. Not an unmitigated good, not an always good. Some governments are pretty much purely evil, all right? But in general, in God's design, and in general today, plenty of exceptions, government is presented as a good thing. Doesn't mean that more and more and more of it is better. I'm a conservative. I would argue that less government is often, not always, but less government is often best. But Romans chapter 13 says that those who are kings, those who are leaders, are ministers of God. The principle of government's authority to use force for the means of restraining evil is derived from the very character of a holy God. God has the right to do as he pleases, of course, and this includes the right to judge evil as God sees fit. And there are people who get all worried about some things that go on in the Old Testament. The problem is they take that out of the context, the broader context of the reality that God is sovereign, and God has the sovereign prerogative to deal with evil as he sees fit, regardless of whether or not it's the way we might see fit, because he sees a lot more than we do, knows a lot more than we do, and that's also part of God's character, right? Omniscience. I'm not anywhere close to that, right? Now, this whole idea of judging evil is something we understand that God delegates in many cases to others. I mean, early in the Bible, very early in the first chapters of Genesis, we see this concept: whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. That's not the institution of government in its fullest sense, but it is the delegation of authority to man that says, when we see that someone takes life frivolously, so much so that he kills another human being, that person is on the line to pay with his own life. And of course, in Romans chapter 13, Paul writes that the government doesn't bear the sword in vain. A sword, folks, is more than a metaphor. It's a deadly instrument. Okay? I don't use a sword to spread butter on my bread. A sword is used for defense and ultimately for deadly force, to take life if need be. That's what Paul was saying, that if it comes to it, government has the prerogative to take life. Now, of course, the idea with this, with all laws, is preventive in nature. It is to dissuade evil people from doing evil things, to discourage people from doing those things they might otherwise do if there were no accountability. Now, that's not necessarily an argument for or against the death penalty in the United States. Like so many issues, it's complicated, and we take that basic scriptural principle as a significant part of our decision making when it comes to its permissibility, but also to its implementation. We'll talk about how we deal with issues, particular issues, in a later episode. Human government, though, is presented as a general good, but that's not always the case, because human government is composed of fallen people who are exercising authority over other people. And those lacking virtue, and we've had governmental leaders and still do, who I fear qualify with that term. Those lacking virtue can be expected to have this lack of virtue greatly magnified when power is given to them. Remember the old saying, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Sometimes, though the Bible presents human government as generally a good, occasionally human government is particularly evil. We don't have a beef with the citizenry, with the dear people of North Korea or of China. Our beef is with their governments, which can only be described as evil. Well, they can be described some other ways, but there is pure evil that comes out of those governments. And those are examples, and there have been obviously plenty of others throughout history, and some others even today, of course. So, though the Bible is presented as a general good, since people run it, it gets messed up. Those who lack virtue, that will be magnified when they're in charge. Those who have basic human virtues have the ability, though, of course, to act virtuously as they lead. Sometimes government's particularly evil, but all human government is ultimately provisional. This earth is not the final state for any of us. And that bears remembering as we as Christians consider how to be involved in government. All right? Well, hi, friends. Since I don't have a sponsor, I decided I would sponsor the podcast myself. Yeah, that's right. This is a commercial for me. Well, not actually for me as a person, but for me as a national instructor of Walk Through the Bible. Walk Through is a ministry dedicated to igniting a passion for God's Word. The cool thing is how Walk Through does it. The main centerpiece Walk Through teaching tool is live events that are hosted by churches or Christian schools, etc. I teach what's called OT Live, which is a 3-hour event where we walk through the big picture of the entire Old Testament so that we see how all of the major people, places, and events fit into that big picture. Sort of like when you work a puzzle. You dump out the box and all the puzzle pieces are sitting on the table, but how do you know where they all fit together? That's easy. You put the cover of the puzzle box right in front of you so you can see what the final picture is supposed to look like, and then you figure out where the pieces fit. A lot of Christians have those puzzle pieces floating around in their minds, but they don't really understand how and where they fit. Walkthrough is like the cover of the puzzle box, so that in a morning's time, you can see how it all fits together. And here's the cool thing. You won't be furiously scribbling notes into a book like you're at some boring seminar. OT Live is the most active learning experience I dare say you'll ever have. And stuff will stick in your brain better than that notebook that you stick on a shelf somewhere and forget all about. I would love to speak with you and with your church or Christian school or you name it about how I could come and share this incredibly fun learning time with you. So those are some of the things that government owes to us, but I want to mention 3 things we find in the Bible that our leaders should be able to expect from Christians. 3 particular things, and then a little more and we're done. Not the longest episode today. That's okay. Some of you will be fine with that, I'm sure. Here's the first thing. The first thing our government should be able to expect from us is honor. Honor. Peter says in his first epistle, chapter 2, honor the king, or by extension, whatever you call the person, the people in charge, whomever that is. Well, that's tough. My party's not in power. So consider that when Peter wrote this, Nero was the guy in charge, a twisted madman who tortured and killed hundreds, maybe thousands of Christians, hated eventually by even the Romans themselves. Can you imagine? You are a first century Christian, and you are reading the words of Peter, and he says, honor the king. And it was your own mother who was crucified by Nero and then made into a human candle to light the gardens at Nero's palace. And Peter says, honor the king. But here's the deal. It's not whether or not the king is honorable or acts honorably, but rather that he is the king, that he is the president, that he is the leader or the speaker of the house or the congressman or the senator or the governor or what have you. It's the position, not necessarily the person whom we are as God's people to honor. We're to extend honor to our leaders. Doesn't preclude criticism. Did I say criticism? This is a podcast. I don't have to go back and fix it, but I'm not going to cut all this out. All right? Criticism doesn't preclude criticism if that criticism is given appropriately. It doesn't preclude opposition channeled through lawful means. It doesn't preclude, of course, holding government and political leaders accountable for the things they say, the laws they pass, the things they do, the lives they live. It means honor. Sometimes it means forgiveness directed toward our leaders, even as we forgive others who sin against us. It means loving our enemies. Though I'm going to argue in a later episode that enemy is the absolute wrong term to use to describe other Americans, regardless of political party, except possibly in very, very extreme circumstances. We shouldn't use the word enemy, but the Bible uses that word. Love our enemies. Enemies is enemy is a stronger word than a more appropriate word to use for someone in a party that we disagree with. I think the word opponent may be a fair word. But if you got to love your enemies, according to Jesus, you got to love your opponents and the opposite party, whatever that might be. What does it take to honor the king? It takes humility to know our role, to understand that before we, in any sense, serve our political leaders, we serve a king to whom our first allegiance must be given. And if that king says in his word, his decree, his command to us, honor your earthly leaders, then we must do it. And we better be careful what we say. Let's go, Brandon is a direct and sinful contradiction to the responsibility of Christians to honor the king. You know what I'm talking about. It's a euphemism, and it's made we know what it means. I didn't know for a while. I actually asked people on Facebook, what does that mean? I was kind of blissfully clueless, and it was blissful, my ignorance there. And they explained it to me, and I said, oh. And I watched the clip that it derived from. And if you say, let's go, Brandon, you're saying the exact same thing. And it's unacceptable for a Christian who wants to honor the king and be serious about obeying God. Awful things were said about Donald Trump as well, things unbefitting a Christian saying them. And about Barack Obama before him, and Bush and Clinton ad infinitum. A number of years ago, I got involved in local theater. Haven't been in a show since before COVID. Looking forward to getting back into one at some point here. And one of the first shows I was involved in was with a gentleman, an older gentleman, and we became Facebook friends. And it wasn't long before he unfriended me. But he did the favor of explaining to me why he unfriended me. And it was this. I had written some things in several blog posts where I did not give due respect to the president. At the time, it was Barack Obama. And he called me out on those. And he was right. And he was right. And I remember getting back with him and saying, can we go to breakfast? He said, sure. And we sat down. I said, Dave, you were right. I was wrong. I'm going to go back through my blog posts. I don't know if I went back to the beginning of them. I've been blogging, wow, almost 20 years now, I guess, although I really haven't written many blogs lately. But I'm going to go back through my blog posts. And when I find that I've violated this principle of honor the king, I'm going to take them down. I don't think Dave was a Christian man, but that was a witness to him that he found to be pretty powerful. And I'm committed to continuing in this vein, no matter who is in leadership. And I'd like to say I've been perfect since then, and I haven't. But I've been a lot better. And the older I get, the more I'm trying to be careful to honor the king, because it's not an optional kind of thing. Honor ought to flow from a gratitude that we have a government to do the things that need being done in our society. Yeah, we can argue about whether they try to do too many things or not enough things. And I can make the argument on both ends. Some things they do, they got no business doing, in my judgment. Some things they're not doing that they should be doing, in my judgment. And I'm sure there are people who disagree on all those counts. That's fine, doesn't matter. But we have a government, and we should have a gratitude, not for everything our government does or our politicians do, but folks, we have so much to be thankful for in this country, which, while imperfect, we as Americans live in a place, in the place, that so many people in our world go to extraordinary lengths to get to. And you know that's true. Because they understand that freedom is the very air we breathe in this country. And I am thankful to God, and you better be as well, if you were born in this country, that God gave me the 1 in 20 opportunity, the 5% chance. I don't believe there's chance. God sovereignly gave me the 5% opportunity to be born in the United States of America. 19 out of 20 people in the world, more than that, do not have that opportunity and are not born here. Thanks to God, our sovereign should issue in honor toward those who rule over us, and it should issue in the next point. And that next point is obedience. Romans chapter 13. God is the giver of all authority that exists. Jesus told Pilate in John 19:11, you could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. And the same is true, by the way, for people who hold positions of authority in the local church. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 says the very same thing. God places those in the right sense of authority over us, leadership in the context of the local church. Romans 13 verse 2 makes this clear. You resist the authorities that God has placed in your life. You rebel against them and don't obey them, and you're resisting God. You are resisting God. So flowing from that gratitude should be that honor and should be obedience. Is there a place for civil disobedience? Yes, but it's tricky and it's rare, and it's more rare than some people, some Christians want to consider, I believe. Now, when Peter and the early church leaders were forbidden to speak of Christ, their response was, we have to obey God rather than men. And that's true. This was a clear, cut and dried case of the government demanding that followers of Jesus disobey Jesus. And in such cases, yes, civil disobedience is warranted, but it should be undertaken with the knowledge that repercussions are likely to follow. You do that, and you may get in trouble with the government. We see it happening in the book of Daniel on several occasions, right? There were repercussions which, if God hadn't miraculously intervened, the 3 Hebrew children, Daniel himself, would have paid a severe price, death, in all their cases, for disobeying the authorities. Daniel is the model for a Christian's attitude and actions toward government, isn't he? He served the king in a foreign government, Babylonia, and he rose to increasing positions of responsibility. He treated the king with respect. He obeyed the government until that ruler made a demand of citizens which came into direct conflict with the command of God. And then he had no choice but to disobey. Oh, you know what? He's a model in another way as well. He prayed 3 times a day, the Bible says. And since he did that, it would be really, really surprising if he didn't pray for those who were in authority. And that leads to our third and final concept. We owe the government honor, we owe it obedience, and we owe prayer. 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 and 2. This is the CSB version. First of all, then, I urge that petitions, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for everyone, for kings, and for all those who are in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. Once again, there isn't some qualification that we pray for those leaders for whom we voted and who we generally support. No, we should pray for leaders regardless, period. You know, one of the things that prayer will do, if we do it right, it'll soften our attitudes. It will make things like honor and obedience at least a little bit easier. Maybe not always easy, but easier. So in addition to what prayer does with regard to the person prayed for, it changes us and our attitudes. Here's my question. Here's my challenge. How much have you prayed for President Joe Biden and for other leaders? Gulp. Does it square with biblical precept? What do we owe government? Honor, obedience, prayer. I want to conclude today, and we're just about done here, with the words of a piece from the Gospel Coalition on the subject of the biblical view of government. I'm going to read them without comment and then sign off for the day. Thanks for listening. And by the way, I hope you'll hit the like button on the podcast. And if you find this podcast and other episodes of it thought-provoking, I hope you'll take the time to share it with a friend. Here's what the Gospel Coalition had to say. The biblical view of government. 1, does not permit cynicism, disrespect, or disengagement. 2, it does not commend blind adherence, nor does it condone violent opposition. 3, the biblical view of government permits patriotism, but forbids idolatry. 4, it encourages volunteerism, but not utopianism. 5thly, it suggests gratitude, vigilance, and dissatisfaction. Finally, it reminds us to pray, Thy kingdom come, Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, that's it for today. And so until next time, I'm Byron Harvey, and I'm just thinking.